Hey, everybody. I am super thrilled to have with me on the show today, Jennifer Lowe. Not that Jennifer Lowe, a far more important Jennifer Lowe, if I do dare say so myself. Although if J-Lo wants to come on the show and talk about how she's innovating dance moves, happy to have her on. But today, I have the incomparable Jennifer Lowe on my show. And I just want to give you a little bit of background and tell you why I wanted so badly to have her on the show. Jennifer is the Senior Design Director in the health domain for IDEO. And if you don't know IDEO, it's an organization I so admire for teaching and retraining ideas around design thinking and how we can constantly reinvent what we're doing for the betterment of our audiences and really ourselves as innovators. So if you don't know them, check out IDEO. But she is prior to joining IDEO, she was the former managing director for innovation and strategy at Kaiser Permanente and has extensive experience in combining clinical subject knowledge with business strategy expertise, not something you always find in healthcare. Jennifer's background is in healthcare service redesign and design, also the leadership of knowledge management and performance improvement systems. And she is also an adjunct professor at Boston University in a couple of different arenas and has served as a guest lecturer in lots of places around the country. So I'm so grateful to welcome you to the show. Jennifer, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
So tell us, how did you even get into the world of innovation to begin with? Because, nobody starts off, going, I want to be a fireman, I want to be a nurse, I want to be an innovation expert. How did you get here?
It's funny that you say that. It was, I want to be a nurse, or actually, I wanted to be a doctor.
Ooh, uh-huh.
But I started out like a lot of people do in the healthcare industry as a clinician. So I had a full ride scholarship from the Veterans Administration to pursue a bachelor's degree in nursing. And I went to St. Louis University. And so my first actual nursing job, real nursing job, was in the VA health system. And I worked both in emergency and cardiothoracic ICU. So lots of hands on nursing. And the VA was an incredible place to train, totally fascinating, absolutely confusing, and a real powerful learning environment, especially if, and at the time I didn't know there was a word for this, if you're kind of a geek about systems, which I found out later that I was. From there, I became a travel nurse. And then, like a lot of young, ambitious nurses, every step that I took, the more leadership experience that I gained, because you gain it pretty quick in nursing, I started to find that I had a lot more questions than I did answers. And
Mm.
that just progressively increased over time. I felt like healthcare was really ripe for change, but I saw so few instances where that change, that necessary change, was accepted, let alone implemented. And so I left healthcare to pursue my MBA at Boston University. And while I was there, it was really fantastic because I gained an incredible education in understanding organizations and strategy, which was something that you don't learn in nursing school. You kind of join one and you recognize it for what it is. But a chance to kind of step back from that and look at it and better understand it, I think, was the real benefit. It was also really helpful. Additionally, at that time, I'm pretty old, Susan. And so at
I
times
don't buy
when
that.
I was in
we
when
can
I
we
was
can
in
catch
grad
open and
school,
count the rings later.
but I was in grad school right when the internet was kind of coming of age and organizations were really starting to think about digital strategy. And it's kind of funny to look back now and think about like people's forays into e-commerce, but I mean that's really where it was. And my first job out of grad school was at Sapient. And so I was
Mm.
hands-on, technology consulting, not initially in the healthcare industry, eventually back into the healthcare industry focus while I was at Sapient. And I think what it taught me was that a digital space was going to be a necessary component for success, whatever that looked like. I also understood the future was going to be difficult to navigate because the speed of change was sort of increasing exponentially. And unquestionably, there were going to be changes that were necessary for people to be successful. And those changes we're going to morph at a more rapid rate. And so
Mm.
I think coming out of that, in my mind, or sort of what had developed over time as I guess the beginning of my time as an innovator was, change is necessary and the responsibility of all leaders. Innovation was going to be a necessary capability to not just succeed, but to survive. And being future forward, I didn't really know what that meant yet, but being future forward was going to be a critical competitive advantage for any organization. And I
Mm.
think that's kind of how I came into innovation, very much through the back door, very much through trial and error and hands on. I wish I could say, like you said, like I just came out innovative by nature, but that wasn't true. I had to work at it.
Yeah.
And I still work at it every day.
But there's something, a couple of things that you said were really fascinating to. First was, I'm a systems geek, and I think of myself as the exact opposite of that. But I'm fascinated by people who have that mindset, because you're able to see things not just at a larger perspective, but you're able to think about, where does the tinkering need to take place in order to make those shifts happen. So when you're addressing something as massive as healthcare, and I'm not saying you are taking on healthcare with a capital H, but we're talking about the advent, that time frame before electronic health records existed, or were even, mandated by the government. And thank God for that shift, right? Like
Yeah,
I hear you, like I think of the juxtaposition between the mindset of Sapient, one of the most forward-thinking digital consulting firms at the time during the internet boom times, and contrasting that with the VA, possibly the most challenging bureaucratic system in healthcare, hands down, right?
absolutely.
Yeah. So can you give us that meshing, Jen, about like how those two things come together, like your perspective on being a systems person and seeing this digital future, and
Yeah.
maybe a look backwards of going, gosh, where do we start?
Yeah. So it's really interesting. I mean, um, maybe that's what made me run towards innovation a little bit.
Mm.
And the same was true of the organizations I worked for when I was a travel nurse. You if you had any sense of curiosity around systems, and that was probably, I would say, the base of everything that has to do with my journey through innovation is fully based on curiosity. I am a
Mm.
very curious person. I have a very short attention span. I say all the time, I'm a professional magpie. I like shiny objects. I have to figure out what they are. And so when I was at the VA, you would see so many aspects of the system's issues at the VA. They were in front of you all the time, right? Ways in which information didn't get pulled over where it needed to be, or ways in which individuals who were being cared for in the system couldn't get to where they needed to be. It was so obvious. When I went to Sapient, I think I ran towards an organizational like Sapient because they had such a robust way of looking at systems and pulling them apart and redesigning, restructuring. And I wanted to be on that end. I wanted to be on the side of somebody sort of pulling it apart, and not necessarily the person stuck in the system at the time or trying to change it. And I think that's an important thing to understand about innovation environments in general. If you want your organization to be innovative, you're going to have to give people a way to pull and push and take apart. If your system is so rigid, so structured that there's no room for that, you can't be innovative. Like
Yeah.
it's just a fact. And so I think when I came out of my MBA program, a lot of organizations that were in traditional healthcare related, those were the organizations that wanted to recruit me. And I can remember going to Sapient and saying, look, I want to work for you guys, but I am not going to do work in the healthcare industry. I want other industry experience. And I remember they thought it was very funny. They were like, all right, come on in. And I was in energy services for a while, an
Mm.
industry I knew nothing about. I did some manufacturing, right? Like I tried to change the lens that I had personally on how to make change in a system, and that really benefited me later when I came back into healthcare. Because I think if you're only in health, there's a lot of healthcare only folks, right? That like grew up in healthcare, stayed in healthcare. It's really hard to understand where there are great benefits in other industries, great lessons learned that can be pulled back in. Because you think of healthcare as such a different beast
So, Jennifer, what do you think are some of the criteria for, working with a company or, as you were diving into your own experiences at Sapient, let's get started, to get started on what are those criteria that makes an organization able to handle innovation?
It's such a good question. And I think it's such an interesting one because I don't even know that I was doing this when I first started to do this work. I think I kind of backed into this role, especially at Kaiser. When I was hired at Kaiser, I was asked to sort of create an innovation capability to change the culture more or less for the leadership team in such a way that innovation was more natural and a capability for that group. And I think about the things that we talked about when we started looking at what organizations really did this well. And there are several things I think really helped innovation thrive, and that may be different depending on the industry, but in healthcare in particular, when you're faced every day with staffing issues and union issues and little things like pandemics, there's a tendency to navel gaze, right? Like all day long and not really ever look up and out because what's happening in the next 5 minutes is so critical. And that's why I think innovation is a muscle, right? It's like a muscle that has to be worked out. It's so easy not to use that muscle, right? It's so easy to leave it on the couch and just get through the day. And then every day is another day where you set it aside. And so you have to make an effort. You have to create an environment where there is space for people to work out that muscle. And for me, using human-centered design, using foresight, and these are the two main tools that I use all the time at KP, that I used all the time at KP, and then I use all the time now at IDEO. They're very much like working out with an innovation trainer, right? They make you think differently. They make you work out that muscle and ask questions and ask difficult questions and
Can we
pique your
break that
curiosity.
down? Yeah, can we break that down? Because some of my
Sure.
audience working in innovation may or may not have, access to this, or frankly, they're working in a different part of the innovation chain where human-centered design may or may not be central to what they're working on. So tell us a little bit,
Mm.
from your perspective. Now you've seen it inside an organization like Kaiser Permanente, but also as a consultant at a place like IDEO. Where does human-centered design, like, can you give us a little bit of background on that to begin with, and
Sure.
then how it's applied?
Sure, absolutely. And I won't be able to give a really in-depth version of it, but I think the easiest way to think about human-centered design is to think of it through a lens of empathy. So
Mm,
the idea behind it is it's just a really robust way of understanding, or some people even say, like some of my colleagues will say, really loving the problem, right? Really understanding what users are dealing with every day, and then trying to find solutions that are human-centered in their style in order to apply those to improve or change something. And so a great example in the healthcare industry in particular is the sort of wide implementation of lean or performance improvement. So I, like everyone else in healthcare that had a consultative type role, spent a lot of time working in performance improvement and process improvement, breaking down processes, seeing where they fail, looking for bottlenecks, then putting fixes in place, testing those fixes. Right? That's a very, very positive improvement for a health system that doesn't have any other kind of sort of improvement system in place. It's a great foundational piece of work. But what I found over time as a practitioner of this, and I was never a very rigid practitioner. So I'm the kind of, back then I was the kind of lean or performance improvement consultant that all other lean consultants hated because I didn't believe in it full face. I thought it's just a tool and there are other tools and you can mix them in and you can kind of Frankenstein a solution. That's how I felt. And
mm,
so my natural inclination always was to look for the next tool. What's something else we can use, something else we can try? And so when we would implement performance improvement techniques or tools, what we ended up getting was a lot of really good but very incremental change. A
mm.
little change here, a little change there. And that's not a bad thing. That's movement in the right direction, but it also tended to be very much focused in and on ourselves. Like, how are we making it better for us as clinicians, as administrators, as people in the system, right? And so I saw a huge need for changing the lens. Like, how can we apply that kind of rigor and that level of improvement, but change the lens that's much more focused on the user, on the patient and their experience. And so at KP, we made a really concerted effort to bring in first, you know, performance improvement, but in a way that was very much thought leadership component. So instead of saying, do this tool, use this technique, we taught everybody in leadership A3 thinking, which is the
What's that?
methodology behind. It's the methodology behind lean. So it's this sort of systematic step-by-step way of breaking down a problem, looking for potential solutions, using the front line, using people with knowledge and experience to pull that apart and think about it, and then testing to see whether or not a prototype, an idea would work, and then implementing it in a robust way with lots of
Mm.
standard work and visual techniques and whatever. So A3 thinking is that methodology behind what makes lean and performance improvement so powerful, right? So it says you have to think of it this way. What is the problem we're trying to solve? What is the current state? What's the future state? What's the gap between those two? What are we going to try? What worked? All right. Rather than coming into a meeting and saying, I have a solution to a problem, right? Which is much more typical. That's a great, robust way of looking at problem solving. It's kind of the first step at becoming a little bit more innovative. So then we added the next step, which was human-centered design. Okay, do all the same things, but this time we really want you to go out a little bit more, think a little bit more broadly, get to know the user much better, talk to them directly, involve patients in the conversation, ask them what they want and need. Don't go convergent so quickly, right? Stay divergent for a while, to accept a lot of different ideas and think about them and test them and make them tangible, right? Have a bias to action, trying stuff instead of talking about it.
So Jen, when you think about, like, I'm so curious because having worked in healthcare institutions and organizations for a solid 10 years, ranging from government to nonprofit to municipal, what have you, international, who do you get on board and who do you have to cajole to say,
Sure.
sure, let's try all of these things and let's not implement for a while. Let's just watch. Let's just take lots of divergence, like, and it's so important, but the impatience, right? Or
Yeah.
in bureaucratic cycles, the whatever, you know, like you're going to do that thing. You're going to watch over here with my arms folded and watch you fail. Ethos, can really be a part of the undertone of what's going on. So tell us, like, what are the groups that you needed to get on board to say yes to doing it this?
Sure. That's probably the most critical question right there. And I
Mm,
will admit that I have been tremendously lucky. I have so many, people I've met over the years, so many colleagues in this space that have a million horror stories about trying to go through this process. For me, that was never the case. I got really lucky. I first learned how to do this work really at Leahy Clinic after Sapient. So I had been at Sapient. I learned how to do this work in a lot of different industries. And I came in back into healthcare um, and was ready and raring to apply different types of thinking, different models, different frameworks. And I was really lucky. I landed at Leahy Clinic
where's that?
under Leahy Clinic is in the Boston area. So right
Uh-huh.
outside of Boston, I think very innovative organization, very physician led. And I ended up under a really innovative leader who had come from Henry Ford. And he was the first person to kind of say, I like where you're going with this. I need you to be intentional about it. I need to see real outcomes, but I'm going to give you a lot of rope. Right.
Mm.
So he did. And it was a really powerful experience to be able to test some of these concepts, to try different things. This is the first place that I ever tried anything really dramatic. That was the place where I pulled physicians into triage in the emergency room, totally different process, to see if we could change the way the ED to inpatient process could be improved, and the amount of time people spent in the ED reduced. That was a really radical thing back then. I think everyone's doing it now, but
What was the
I had a
outcome
lot
of
of,
that? Just in the short term, what was the
oh my
outcome
goodness.
bringing these two groups together?
Yeah, that was my favorite outcome number ever. We went from, this was a small, I worked for Leahy North, which was a small offshoot of the main Leahy Clinic. And so it was a really great place to test. And we had a small, much more community based ER. And people were spending on average length of stay of about 5 hours in the emergency room for things as simple as, a sprained ankle, a sore throat. And we implemented that change as a test. We piloted the concept of a physician in triage, and we took the length of within 24 hours, the length of stay went from on average 5 hours to like 45 minutes, if I think I'm remembering that correctly.
Wow,
And
wow.
it was amazing. And honestly, that was what made the big difference for me at Leahy Clinic. That was the first test we ever ran. And we took that and story told it all over Leahy. And that just got us more and more rope, right? If we could prove that we could do something that was critically important for patient care, for how physicians and staff worked, or for the bottom line, they would go with you on the next trip. And so when I came to KP, P is a totally different environment from any other healthcare organization where I worked. It's huge, and it could be really rigid and structured because of the size, right? But instead, KP really prides itself on pushing the boundaries a little bit of what is the best way to care for people, what is the best way to care for the money that they spend on their healthcare. It's just a very different, an integrated system in health is just a very different kind of system. All the incentives are aligned the right way, and that's really rare, right? And that environment was a really powerful environment to come into, and I came into it in Silicon Valley. So
Mm.
there is a regional component to that. I went to the largest region at KP, the most powerful region at KP, in an area known for innovation, right? Where like the people in the garage coming up with new ideas is, what this area prides itself on. And in the probably the largest and most powerful of the medical systems within KP, Northern California. And what was fantastic about that is there was a sense of really needing to innovate. Like there was a real openness to it. And I think that made a huge difference. I could come in and there was a group of leaders who were willing, who were open-minded, who were curious. There were two executive leaders who were very forward thinking and very open to trying things and very okay with a failure. And I think that makes a huge difference. You have to have a couple of real critical things in place for an innovation system to exist. People have to be curious.
Yep.
There has to be an openness to ideas, to
Mhm.
failure, to change. And there needs to be optimism. I think that's the real differentiator. What drew me to KP and definitely drew me then to IDEO is that there's an energy in problem solving when it comes from a place of optimism. And that's where innovation thrives.
Mm.
It's really easy to get a group of people together and tear apart a system and say everything that's wrong with it.
Right.
There's no energy in coming from that place if you don't have optimism.
Yeah. Well, I think there's this ethos. Are you a critic or are you a creator? And
Totally.
I saw this funny little meme. It was a quote from Thomas Edison, and it said, "The optimist creates the airplane, the pessimist creates the parachute. Both of them are desperately needed in innovation." And I thought,
Absolutely.
wow, that is so
It's very
spot on.
powerful.
Yeah, we need everybody to come to the party and play, but sometimes the parachute people can get in the way of us even making the airplane if we're not careful, right? It's important
Absolutely.
to figure out at what point the pessimist is invited to the party.
Yeah, and it's also important to know when to have the pessimist along. I'm a true believer, and this may come from my experience in performance improvement. I'm a true believer in having a pessimist on board when you're
Mm,
taking on an initiative. I
mhm.
think it is so easy to all be up in the balloon, right? Up high and thinking that's where I like to be, right? That's
Sure.
the core of my existence. The thing that makes me maybe decent at what I do is that I love being at the 50,000 foot level, right? And I have all that optimism and all that energy around that. And it takes someone to anchor me often for us to have a lot of success, right? So my
Yeah.
most successful environments were where I had maybe one or two leaders that were up there with me in the balloons, and one or two leaders that provided the great foundational anchor. And then it was the tension between those two things that helped us get to a great solution, right? So I think that's another, really key factor for
Yeah.
sure,
So creativity, flexibility,
for
giving
sure.
people a long enough rope, as they say, to fail or to hang yourself is sometimes the other side of that rope. But then also, uh, correct me if I'm wrong, but there needs to be a place where we make some serious decisions, right? We come to forks in the road and we
Absolutely.
go, okay, we can't fail anymore. So can you give us an example of, an innovation that you were working on, maybe at Kaiser Permanente, that you gave it a shot, you kept going, but at some point you got the sense that this isn't working. What can our listeners learn from innovations that whose finish line is actually failure? If we can use the F word. I think on this call we're all comfortable with the F word.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I would say I've been around a long time. So I've had lots of lowercase f failures. We've had lots of
Mm,
prototypes fail. I've had lots of tests fail. The one that sticks in mind the strongest, we got a group of people together, a total brain trust at KP to address a specific disease process. And I can remember thinking, this is like a power team when I came in the room. Every physician, every, forward thinking administrative and clinical person, educators, all the people that worked around this particular disease process were present. And the level of intention to do the right thing was so high. So I think that's one thing you have to remember in healthcare is that innovation in healthcare is usually built out of need and a tremendous desire to do the right thing.
mm,
And sometimes, like, if you don't put that in the right place, if you don't allow it to catalyze like a chance at making a mistake, then it can hold you back, right? And I will say this is one time where we said, okay, we're going to get in the room, we're going to do the right thing by the patient. This particular patient group was really not being served in the way that we were hoping they would be. And everybody came to the room with a desire to see that improved. And we made the cardinal mistake at the start of not defining the problem before we let the solutions get hold of us. And in an effort to give something back to the patient that was, something that they would value the experience of, something that was easy and efficient for them. They only had to come in once. They got everything at one time. All these things that were powerful drivers at the time for improving care. We just let those flow and we flowed with them and we really didn't ask the serious questions. And so we set up a test. We had all the best intentions. And the test was in its own way, this prototype and test was an expensive one because we had, staffing changes associated with it to try and see would this pilot work and how to do it. And it failed miserably. And
oh
it failed
gosh.
miserably because we didn't ask the patient what they wanted. And it
So
was the
who did you
simplest
ask
reason.
out of curiosity as we
We
talk
asked
about,
ourselves.
human-centered design?
We thought we were being very human centered. I mean, this is really funny. This is before I really got in depth into human centered design. I thought this was tremendously human centered, and I was one of the leaders on this. And I can remember a couple moments where I was like, oh, maybe we should stop a second and make sure we're asking the right questions. But there was so much excitement and engagement in the room, and I just floated down the river with everybody else. And this great, we're going to do this amazing thing. We're going to build this thing that they want, and they didn't want it. They didn't want it. They actually didn't want it to be more efficient. They wanted time to consider what they were experiencing from this disease process. They did not want to come in and get all this information at one time. But because we didn't ask the right questions, because we didn't go directly to the patient, because we allowed the solution to drive the problem, the potential solutions to drive the problem of great intentioned people, right? We had a failure, but it depends on how you look at failure, Susan. Like, to me, that was a great failure. It was a great failure because that's what spurred us on to really learn human-centered design. We
So
made a change right away so that we could build something that they did want. So it was a failure that fueled a ton of innovation afterwards.
so in hindsight, not taking the patient into account, what was the intended outcome and what did you actually wind up with?
The intended outcome was a new program that was multidisciplinary, right? So you're hearing all the keywords right at the time, like multidisciplinary, efficiency, innovation, right? So the patients were supposed to receive a diagnosis and immediately have at their fingertips all the disciplines that were necessary for them to receive care. And what we found instead was that they couldn't take the information in that way. It was not the right experience because they needed time to absorb what they were hearing and then time to sort of grieve a little bit about what their life felt like it was and now would be with this new disease process involved, and then make positive changes, right? And then, engage the system to help them. Um, I think we thought we were like doing this great. They park one time, they come in, they get everything at once, but they weren't prepared for that. So, not asking the patient, not going to the source, and really empathizing and understanding the need meant that we were designing around the wrong problem
Mm,
completely, all
mhm.
with the best intentions, right? So,
Always.
I mean, if you're innovating, you're failing more often than you're succeeding. I mean,
Yeah.
or else you're really not pushing the envelope.
It's funny. I spent 6 summers at the World Series of Poker representing 44 professional poker players in my PR days. And what was fascinating to me about that game was that the greatest poker players in the world folded 80% of the time. So
Sure.
they would look at their hands and go, nope, not this time, not this time. And so the failure rate, right, for each hand dealt was actually dramatically high. But when
Sure.
you narrowed it down to, figuring out the opportunity, figuring out where to actually put money on the table, how all in to go at what stage, right? How far to bet at what stage of the game was really some of the most critical decision making out there. But it started with, okay, this isn't going to work. This isn't going to work. And having the tolerance and frankly, the maturity to sit there and go, we're not just going to execute because we can, but
Right.
rather we have to create scenarios in which there's the greatest opportunity for success. And
Yeah, that
sometimes that's
calculated
feeding.
risk.
Yeah, absolutely. They call that M in poker, is figuring out when the greatest opportunity, that access point of risk and opportunity come together. So, as you now, so you've been on the side where you're actually creating incredible design systems, right? Rethinking how healthcare, and especially from the perspective of an organization that's largely health provider and insurance provider, right?
Yes.
Simultaneously. What do you think is the biggest shift that you saw over the 12 years that you were working at KP in human centered design or design thinking even taking place there?
So it kind of goes back to what we built over time. So I have to go back a little bit to explain it. When I was first hired into the role, I was hired really to change the culture, right?
Mhm.
So there was this great, energetic, intelligent leadership team. It's quite large, right? There's a small leadership team of about just under 30 people and a large leadership team of about 250 leaders, right? And those teams were filled with people who were sort of ready and raring to go in terms of how can we change the way we're caring for patients and how can we change the nature of healthcare. They were in that place. And so I was hired initially to help establish a journey that we could follow that would get us to a place of being more innovative. So the first thing I did was implement performance improvement because, again, it provides a foundation for problem solving, a rigorous structure for thinking through problems. People learn how to test, pilot, and fail in a safe environment, basically. And then we added in human centered design, as I said, trying to change that lens, make sure that we were looking at the patient. I think the critical change for us was when we took on foresight. So we had a pretty good sense of how to improve what we were doing and a better sense of how to empathize with and understand our users and involve them in the problem.
That's the
But
human
what
centered
we
design part,
That's
right?
the human centered design part. And
And the
that
other
part
part.
was
Mhm. Go
But
ahead.
what we found was that when we were doing strategic planning, when we were thinking about what is next, that usual annual, effort, people were really tactical still in their thinking, right? So and that makes sense, right? Performance improvement in itself only brings incremental change. We were teaching people to incrementally get better. And so we started looking for something else that would help people pull their horizon out a little bit further in their strategic thinking. And so it was kind of funny. We started talking about this in about 2019. So we were kind of considering teaching futures thinking and did start teaching it loosely as an interest area, something kind of fun for the leaders to take on. Um, I don't think we really thought of it as being an integral part of the toolbox that our leaders were using. It was more something exciting and interesting for them to learn. And then in the fall of 2019, we decided, okay, now it's time to take a stand a little bit. We really think that foresight is key to our success in the future at this medical center. We really want to double down. We really want to teach this, and we want to integrate it into how we think and how we do things. And so, I mean, think about the timing of this. The fall of 2019, we taught, or I taught, the components of foresight very much like I would have done in the classroom for graduate students, right? So, how to find weak signals, how to understand drivers, how to integrate those two and create scenarios and tell stories of the future, how to look at alternate futures and how to plan for those, and how to design and create a preferred future. So we taught this over a span of about 4 months. And at the end of that time, which was at the end of 2019, beginning of 2020, we said, okay, now we're going to challenge you. Your strategic planning is going to use a foresight template. And so we, created an action roadmap and said, okay, if you can look 10 years down the road, then you can figure out about the 5-year time frame. What are those strategic steps you need to take in the 5 to 10-year time frame, and what are the tactical steps in 1 to 2 years? And then you're going to plan off of that. And it was really kind of funny. Right as we were doing this is when the pandemic hit, and obviously we kind of had inklings of it before the general public did, but this was already very much on the forefront of every leader's mind in healthcare. And what we found out, even at that time, the majority of the leaders we were working with, the vast majority, were really excited about thinking about the future, which is strange to think about because at that point, we didn't have a vaccine. We were really under the gun to start caring for a lot of people. We were having really difficult conversations. I have a visceral memory of this time of going into meetings and talking about adding patients to rooms and putting more than one patient on a ventilator, and what it would take for us to care for these patients. And there was every reason to not be optimistic. And we were like in head to toe PPE, and there were tents outside. We were ordering cooling trucks, and
Right.
you know
Terrifying. Mhm.
trying to build vaccine infrastructure and testing infrastructure, and it was kind of all hands on deck. And so, to think about something outside of the pandemic and the immediate day-to-day COVID response actually kind of turned out to be a vacation for the brain for a lot of our leaders. It gave them something to be optimistic about. And for those teams that were really future forward and thinking, they were super innovative, Susan.
Mm.
Every day I was getting, emails and notes like, come down to our department today, look what we built, look what we created, right? We needed to find some way to change a face mask to allow us to look in a microscope. And so we took it down to the shop and we rebuilt this and we built this and created this. And it was fascinating to watch in the first year of the pandemic, that sort of tangible sense of I am an innovator become
Yeah.
very, very real for people.
Yeah, that
Um,
coronavation that we were talking about before we
Coronavation,
recorded. Yeah.
absolutely.
It turned
So
all
I
of
think
us into pivoters, right? We really had to rethink our roles in that moment.
I think so. And I think, we joked around all the time. Myself and the two senior leaders I worked for at KP, we would say all the time, you can't let a good pandemic go to waste. Like,
Eh,
when are you ever going to have this critical of a change occur? Don't let it just go by. Right. So that's what we did. We said, we're going to focus on the future. We're going to double down on that. And And we're going to start asking these questions, even in a time when we're so much more compelled to look down. We're going to force ourselves to look out. And so we had this huge cultural change happen. And that happened over a long span of time, right? Where leaders were really beginning to think about themselves as problem solvers and innovators, and sort of build out their teams to be the same. That was about an 8-year time frame. That was the culture change. But there were tangible results of this as well. There were 3 big futures projects, for example, that got launched out of that time frame in the 2021 timeframe, when nothing should have been launched except what you had to do. And that was thoughts about the future of lifestyle medicine, work around the future of behavioral health, work around the future of primary care. Those had dedicated teams, leaders working on them. So it was really a compelling time period.
Yeah. And such a good reminder to us. And, you know, for my listeners who are thinking about their colleagues and looking around them, I can't think of a job that has greater immediacy than a physician or a nurse who is literally treating a person who's in a life or death situation laying in front of them. And yet the necessity to think 3 to 5 years ahead of them. Like, we're not talking about CEOs who are, trying to hit quarterly numbers. We're talking about
Right.
someone dying in front of you. And still, and yet, and absolutely, and must take place. What are we going to do 3 to 5 years from now while I'm saving this person's life?
Yeah,
So and next time you're for my listeners, next time you're in a meeting and the guy says, we can't focus on this. We got to figure out our quarterly numbers today. We got to figure out our sales projections. If doctors and nurses, heroic, really, doctors and nurses during this time frame could coronavate, so could the rest of us.
absolutely.
And certainly no excuse as the pandemic, begins to subside, at least here in the United States. Although, for all of you listening who are resting, right, we can see the implications of what's happening in China at the moment. And
Absolutely.
their simple shift in policy by letting people do what they do could have massive implications on your quarterly numbers based on what China is capable of doing and its supply chain and its people power and its ability to innovate along with it. So let's keep it in mind, all very important things. So, as we come to our time together, down to the close of our time together, I always ask people on the show 3 questions. So first I'll ask you, what do you think is the greatest innovation in human history? Or one of the 3? Just choose
Wow.
one.
That's a really tough question. And it's this is such an easy answer. And I wish I had a much more compelling one, but I think it's built out of the time that I became a professional person. But I think the internet, the ability to get information, I have teenagers. So I have 2 people who live in my home who never knew a world without the ability to get an answer to anything in a moment. And I remember what it was like when I was a kid and you had to go see a travel agent to take a trip, or you had to take out a phone book and look something up. It's just such a game changer in every way, shape, and form, bad and good. To me, it's probably the most powerful change that we've had in the last, century. But I'm
Beats
sure
fire, beats penicillin, beats.
I know I should really say penicillin, considering I come from healthcare, but the internet is just, to me, it's just fascinating.
Right. If you could join any innovation team in human history, which would you choose to join?
Oh,
What would you
oh,
love
this
to
is such an
learn?
easy answer for me.
Oh yeah.
I'm such a nerd. We all think of what is the career you would have had if you were a different person, right? These dreams. I used to want to be an archaeologist and all these other things, but the one dream that I probably could never accomplish because I am not a numbers person, but am utterly fascinated with, is anything having to do with NASA. And man, would I have loved to have been on any of the NASA teams who are dealing with launch issues or new equipment or new things going into the sky. I would have loved to have been on an innovation team like that,
Well,
even just to watch them work.
just the way you jerry-rigged getting on this Zoom call today is, I think, makes you a candidate for the next mission.
There we go. NASA will be knocking at your door.
And lastly, what is an innovation that you would love to see happen in the world that hasn't
Um,
happened yet? So something that drives you absolutely insane that you wish somebody would fix, or something you would just love to see because it would give you joy.
It's so interesting that you asked that because I just had a really long conversation with some colleagues at IDEO last week about this. I really have such a desire to be part of the change in healthcare that needs to happen to make it equitable in the US. I would love to see what we could do if we put the best minds on it. And I swear I have a list of 10 people, if anyone's listening to this, who's in a position of power, who could immediately start working on this, my name included, though I would be the least intellectual of the group. But I would love to see healthcare looked at from a completely different perspective and transformed so that anyone in the US could receive the best care possible, such that their life is improved. I just think it's the crux of so much. And if we look at how we define health, and I think I may have said something at the very beginning of the call where I said back then I thought about health as health delivery. To me, the definition of health is so much broader these days. It's about climate and food availability and water and public education and access to information and access to care. And I think if we can ever figure out how to start asking the right questions, the hard questions that it will take to make care more equitable, both in the US and outside of the US, I would, happily, finish my career and retire if I could even see the beginning of that trajectory. So,
Yeah. Well, I think some of the really smart consulting groups out there, like Deloitte has it, the Health Equity Institute, that
yes,
is really trying to bring policymakers and corporate decision makers together on how to do that. And certainly there are some nonprofit and governmental organizations that are looking at that. And for listeners, if you want to listen to my interview with Sheila Facile at Boston Medical Center, she is running the equity program at that hospital where they're even growing vegetables on the roof of the hospital to give to patients to take
that's
home with
amazing.
them so they have healthy vegetables with them. So there are ways of making this happen. And I think, greater heads will prevail to make it happen. So
I
Jennifer,
agree.
well, thank you so much for being on the show today. If people want to find out what you and IDEO are doing and how to get some of this, forward thinking idea as well as human centric design, where can people find you?
Absolutely. IDEO is literally as it sounds, IDEO. Go to IDEO.com, which is the website for IDEO, and see some of the projects and programs that we're working with. It's a really fascinating place to work right now. It is optimism at work for
Mm,
sure. And there's some great case studies that you can look at under a sort of a guiding principle that we've had about the work that can't wait, and healthcare equity being one of those. And I think, I hope that we're going to do some great work in this area, and I'm excited to be there, and equally as proud to have been where I was before. I think KP will do amazing work, and it's a place to watch. And I just really have enjoyed, Susan, meeting you and talking to you. I think we have a lot of commonality in our backgrounds, and so appreciate you telling the story of innovators. I think we can all learn from that. So thank you so much for the time.
well, I'm honored folks want to come on and tell their stories just like you, Jen. So thank you so much.
Thank you.